Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, March 13th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est Odesse cum lacerus. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are not aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, an international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is talk about U.S. war making. There's news today that influences how the U.S. will carry on this war making in days to come. The Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has been fired, and he's been replaced with Mike Pompeo, the head of the CIA. What this means is not entirely clear, but it has one effect of bringing the second in command of the CIA to the top of that terror organization. The second in command is a woman called Gina Haspel. In 2017, the European Center for Constitutional Rights called on Germany's public prosecutor to arrest Gina Haspel on a warrant that she was in charge of a torture site in Europe, in Germany, during the Bush administration. That happens to be true. She was, and she went from that to become second in command of the CIA, and now this torturer is appointed head of the CIA. Not a good sign. As far as the replacement of Tillerson with Pompeo, we have to see what this will come to mean. But there is a long-standing debate in the U.S. government over which of the potential enemies of the United States should be favored in order to disfavor the other one. I'm talking about China and Russia here. And the leaders of American foreign policy have for a long time differed on whether the U.S. should favor China in order to make things difficult for Russia, or whether the U.S. should favor Russia in order to do the same for China. The late Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was responsible for a good bit of American terrorism in the last generation, hated Russia and thought that some sort of favorable stance towards China was therefore a good idea in order to divide the two. Henry Kissinger, who in the Nixon administration had been responsible for the opening of China, in fact felt the other way. He thought that Russia should be favored, as apparently the early Trump administration did, in order to make things more difficult for China. Now, there's some suggestion that the recent entente with the North Koreans that the Trump administration seems to be pressing forward with is in fact a pro-China and therefore anti-Russia move. So the situation remains complex in terms of the administration, but its war provocations against Russia and China, unfortunately, seem to continue. To turn from the general war situation in the United States to the local scene, we find that the war is bound up with the local primary election next week on the 20th, Tuesday the 20th, a week from today. There is a primary election in Champaign-Urbana. Democratic and Republican primaries will be run on that day. In this is to choose candidates to run in the fall election. The only way to vote against the war in the next week's primary election is to vote for the Democrat David Gill, the only candidate in the election who calls for an end to U.S. war-making around the world. David Gill, Dr. David Gill, as he's an emergency room physician, is referred to that way, is running for the Democratic Party's nomination for the seat in the House of Representatives in Washington, presently occupied by Republican Rodney Davis. That's the seat from Illinois Congressional District 13, in which we live. His opponents, Gill's opponents in the Democratic primary, include Betsy Londrigan, a former staffer for Senator Dick Durgan, Eric Jones, a former Illinois Assistant Attorney General, and Jonathan Abel, a college teacher and former U.S. Navy intelligence officer. These three are all establishment candidates, Democratic Party establishment candidates. Gill is the outlier here in that the three support the war-making that the U.S. is doing around the world, and Gill is opposed to it. Davis, the present incumbent in this congressional seat, supports the wars the U.S. is conducting around the world, as do his putative Democratic opponents, with the exception of Gill, the only one to answer yes to my question, should U.S. troops and weapons be brought home from the Middle East and North Africa? At a recent candidates forum sponsored by the Champaign County Young Democrats, the others answered no. Abel, in particular, who boasted of his service, in quotes, as a military officer from Yugoslavia to the Mideast, where the U.S. has prosecuted criminal wars since the Clinton administration. A friend reports that at another Democratic Party 13th Congressional Candidate Forum, this one at the Plumbers and Pipe Fitters Union Hall, quote, Gill not once but twice, in response to two different questions, spoke out against the U.S. imperial wars by tying them to draining our economy, which prevents us from having free college tuition for all and Medicare for all. Of course, the other three candidates were silent on that account. Our friend David Johnson of the excellent World Labor Hour on WRFU notes that, quote, currently Gill is neck to neck in the polls for the first place at 40% each with Betsy Dirksen-Londrigan, which is difficult to believe if you've ever seen her speak, and the blatant neoliberal position she supports. Abel is in last place with 7%, and Jones, this is David Johnson's description, the sneaky neoliberal who tries to come across as, oh shucks, I'm just an ordinary guy from a small town, is second to last at 14%. Despite Jones having 10 times more money than all the other candidates. This is checkable at the website opensecrets.org that talks about the money local candidates are spending on their election. The current administration, as we know, inherits 8 wars from the previous administration, Obama being the first U.S. president ever to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and the Philippines. More than 250,000 U.S. military personnel are today deployed in 1,000 foreign bases, most of them ringing Russia and China. Obama's drone assassinations, which killed thousands and were accurately called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, continue under Trump, as do the war provocations against Russia and China, from Ukraine to the South China Sea. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in no less than 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, torture, and murder. Much of the world regards them as nothing less than American death squads. If American leaders were put on trial today, as German leaders were at Nuremberg after World War II, for launching aggressive war, they, like the German leaders, would be hanged. President Obama was elected as an anti-war candidate, but in office he sent thousands of additional U.S. troops into America's longest war in Afghanistan. President Trump, who promised caution and non-intervention in foreign policy and described Hillary Clinton as a trigger-happy warmonger, has now done the same thing himself. Trump is perhaps the weakest U.S. president since Calvin Coolidge. But what both Obama and Trump knew is that in spite of intense media propaganda, most Americans don't want U.S. troops engaged in foreign wars and don't see the killing as justified. Both candidates had to seem to be opposed to those wars in order to get elected. But the 1%, the U.S. economic elite, do want the wars. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the least damaged major country on either side and controlled the world economy. America's wars since then, in Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, and the Mideast, have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the purpose of maintaining that economic control. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. The Australian journalist and filmmaker John Pilger wrote before the last election, quote, "The CIA has demanded Trump not be elected. Pentagon generals have demanded he not be elected. The pro-war New York Times, taking a breather from its relentless low-rent Putin smears, demands that he not be elected. Something is up. These tribunes of professional war are terrified that the multi-billion-dollar business of war, by which the United States maintains its dominance, will be undermined if Trump does do a deal with Russian President Putin and then with China's President Xi Jinping. Their panic at the possibility of the world's great power talking peace, however unlikely, would be the blackest farce were the issues not so dire," close quote. We must demand that foreign military bases be closed, U.S. troops and weapons be brought home, and social support, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income, be provided for Americans immiserated by generations of U.S. government wars. David Gill is the only local candidate in the current election cycle who favors that. There's another aspect of the local Democratic primary next week. Chris Hedges notes that 1/4 of all the Democratic challengers in competitive House district races across the country have a background in intelligence, the CIA, the NSA, or naval intelligence or military intelligence, like candidate Jonathan Abel. The potential influx of military intelligence personnel into the legislature has no precedent in American U.S. political history, and it's hard to see that as an accident, given that the political establishment is so frightened of the possibility, indicated in the campaign, that Trump might actually make peace with Russia and China. He's certainly shown little indication of doing so. He's stuck with the program since he's become president, but he did say that during the campaign, and he did manage to frighten the political establishment very deeply. And I think the number of political intelligence veterans running for Congress in this current cycle are a result of that. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the war-making of the U.S. government and the tendency of the government that we're responsible for to make warlike provocations against nuclear powers such as Russia and China. This is a very serious situation, and it is not being well reported in American mainstream media. We did hear a report, though, of the equivalent of the State of the Union speech, the State of the Nation speech, that Russian President Vladimir Putin gave on the 1st of March. And that was presented in American media as full of nuclear threats. In fact, if you read the speech, I did, it's substantial, that's not true at all. It's another example of the Russiagate spin that we've been getting from American media that has completely misrepresented the actual state of relations between the U.S. and Russia, particularly along the line that Trump is Putin's puppet. Pretty silly to begin with, and not an innocent reflection at all, but an attempt to try to support the American provocations towards war against Russia and China. President Putin's March 1st presentation of new Russian weapons has been greatly misunderstood as a declaration of strategic parity, equivalence with the United States, or triumphalism. There was a much more urgent need, namely, to prevent an imminent strike against Russia by the United States. The danger is not over yet, because a week later, on March 7th, President Putin emphasized his readiness to employ the nuclear weapons for retaliation purposes, even if it would end the world. Quote, "Certainly it would be a global disaster for humanity, a disaster for the entire world," Putin said, "but as a citizen of Russia and the head of the Russian state, I must ask myself, why would we want a world without Russia?" Close quote. This was a bold answer. A lesser man would probably reply hypocritically, dodging the brutal, "Yes, I will destroy the world." It means that the danger is still imminent, but that by these frank words, President Putin wants to dissuade whoever intends to push him too far. Guess who that might be? Why, indeed, all of a sudden did the Russian president decide now, of all times, to tell the world about these new weapons? It's not that the Russians, or the Americans for that matter, are accustomed to deliver hardware updates in general. And 2002, the year the U.S. withdrew from the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was consigned to history years ago. Most Americans don't know that that happened 15 years ago, 16 years ago. What was the reason, or at least the trigger? Some observers bet it was a wily pre-election trick, but there's a Russian election coming up, a wily pre-election trick aimed at a domestic audience by President Putin. This could be a consideration, but it was a minor one. The leading opponent of Mr. Putin in this election, the communist candidate Mr. Grudinin, didn't argue against Putin's foreign policy or defense spending. The voters do approve of Putin's foreign policy anyway, the Russian voters. Putin's revelation made Russians proud, but they would vote for Putin anyway. The reason for Putin's speech was a different and more urgent one, a terrible crescendo of threats that had made Russia feel very vulnerable. Presumably, their spy agencies convinced the Russian leader the threats were real. The U.S. establishment has been looking for a way to humiliate and punish Russia since Mueller's indictment of 30 Russians, the Russiagate nonsense that has been going on in Washington. The indictment alleged that, quote, "the Russian conspirators wanted to promote discord in the United States and undermine public confidence in democracy," in the words of Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General overseeing the Mueller inquiry. It did not matter that the indicted Russians weren't officials of the Russian state, that their effort, if they existed at all, were puny, a few ads at the cost of about $100,000, a drop in the ocean compared to the vast amounts of money spent by both the Clinton and Trump campaigns. However, the U.S. establishment called these minor actions of private Russian citizens an act of war. On February 19th, Glenn Greenwald summed up the U.S. reactions in a piece called "A Consensus Emerges, Russia Committed an Act of War on par with Pearl Harbor and 9/11. That was the title. He reminded us that senators from both parties, such as Republicans John McCain and Democrat Jeanne Shaheen, have long described Russian meddling in 2016 as, quote, an act of war. Hillary Clinton described Russia's alleged hacking of the Democratic National Committee and John Podesta's email inbox as a, quote, cyber 9/11. Tom Friedman of the New York Times said that Russian hacking was, quote, a 9/11 scale event. They attacked the core of our democracy. That was a Pearl Harbor scale event. This was repeated throughout the American media. After the indictment, the Mueller mention of the Russian troll farm, the comparison became a commonplace bit of rhetoric. The Washington Post's Karen Tumulty, complaining about President Donald Trump's inaction, asked readers to, quote, imagine how history would have judged Franklin D. Roosevelt in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor if he had taken to the radio waves to declare that Tokyo was laughing their asses off. Or if George W. Bush had stood in the rubble of the World Trade Center with a bullhorn and launched a name-calling tirade against the Democrats, close quote. These are what Trump has done in response to this Russiagate inquiry. Greenwald concluded, if Russian election meddling is on par with Pearl Harbor and 9/11 attacks, then should the U.S. response be on a par with the response to those attacks? In other words, the U.S. politicians and media called to give Russia the same treatment the U.S. gave to Japan. That was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, remember? And to Afghanistan. That was an invasion followed by 16 years of war. This is for Russian meddling, as the Mueller investigation describes it. In the search for escalation from fiery talk to fire, the Anglo-American establishment turned to the familiar device of alleged Syrian gas attacks. People have been trained to respond to such accusations, and alternately to keep mum while the U.S. bombs Mosul and Raqqa, or prepares to nuke North Korea, as it was doing a couple of weeks ago. Assad, the president of Syria, and Russia were accused of gassing the rebel stronghold of eastern Ghouta, the West's last chance to enforce regime change in Syria by virtue of its location near the capital. Eastern Ghouta is occupied by jihadist terrorists that the U.S. pays for from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and elsewhere, and that they control this bit of territory on the edge of Damascus that is the last redoubt, the last holdout of the terrorist war against the president of Syria that the Obama administration supported in hopes to bring down the government of Syria. The alleged gas chlorine attack, the alleged attack by the Assad government, was reported on January 25th, and it was immediately denied by the Russians and the Syrians. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that this anonymous bogus report had been originated in the U.S. in order to denigrate Syrian government and its troops, to accuse them of war crimes, and to cause permanent breakup of Syria. The U.S. and its allies, he said, were, quote, simply exploiting baseless allegations of toxic weapons use by Damascus as a tool of anti-Syrian political engineering, close quote. And that seems absolutely true. The rebels said they were attacked by chlorine gas. The rebels are the terrorists, the jihadists that the U.S. supports in Syria. The rebels said they were attacked by chlorine gas, as opposed to previous times when they claimed the gas sarin was used. Chlorine gas is a tricky stuff. It is not deadly, though unhealthy for inhaling. It is also quite difficult to monitor and verify, for chlorine is widely used for domestic purposes from cleaning bathrooms to purifying water, and is not a banned substance, though the gas chlorine is forbidden. The difficulty to verify had made it an easy one to claim. The situation in East Ghouta, this large area on the edge of the capital, Damascus of Syria, was a replay of Aleppo, the northern Syria city, reports of few wounded children, films produced by the White Helmets, and stubborn attempts by the rebels to prevent civilian exodus from the area. Whenever the rebels are pushed hard, they produce a story of suffering civilians and of gas attacks, hoping the U.S. will force the Syrian government and their Russian allies to relent. Undoubtedly, civilians have suffered in the Syrian war. However, there is a way to end their suffering. The rebels, the jihadists, could lay down their arms and join the political process like everybody else. There are plenty of Americans unhappy with the Trump regime, but they do not shell Washington, D.C. They hope for a better and different outcome in the next elections. Their example can be emulated by the Syrian rebels, and then the civilians won't suffer. If that's too much to ask for, they can let the civilians leave and fight to the bitter end if they want to. But no, they do not let the civilians out of East Ghouta, this area outside Damascus. Instead, they produce reports of civilian sufferings and wait for the cavalry to arrive to ride in and save them. There was an extra angle. The rebels of East Ghouta are trained and led by British and American intelligence officers, and they came under Russian fire. Perhaps it was a Russian payoff for the bombardment of oil field installations near Deir ez-Zor, where the Russian private military company bore the brunt of and suffered many casualties. Terra Maison, the well-known French journalist resident in Damascus, claimed that Russian ground troops also participated in the assault on eastern Ghouta. It's possible that the Russians and the Americans are already fighting directly in Syria, although both sides are loath to admit their losses. The British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson was the first to, quote, seriously consider, close quote, airstrikes in Syria. He missed the fun of Libya, where, as you remember, Mrs. Clinton said, we came, we saw, he died. And now the British Foreign Secretary is eager to bomb anybody. However, his parliament does not allow him to do so. The ball was taken up by the Americans. Bloomberg editorialized, quote, it's time for another red line, one that the U.S. won't back away from. Trump should tell President Assad of Syria and his Russian backers that any more proved use of any chemical weapon, including chlorine, will be met with greater retaliation than what happened in April, close quote. This is a reference to Trump's cruise missile attack on Syria's Shayrat air base, allegedly in revenge for a Syrian gas attack in Khan Sheikhoun. Doubts about this Syrian gas attack emerged right away. In June 2017, Seymour Hersh exposed the full story behind Shayrat. There was no sarin attack, and President Trump was told by his own intelligence officers to drop the case. He still insisted and attacked, but warned the Russians in advance, and there were no Russian or Syrian casualties and very little damage at the cost of $100 million to the U.S. taxpayer for the one attack, $100 million. The U.S. mainstream media was exuberant and congratulated Trump with this example of presidential behavior. The American conservative magazine, the Republican and Trump-friendly site, objected to plans to bomb Syria. Quote, Trump had no authority to order the attack on Syrian forces last year, and he still doesn't have it now. There is no international mandate for U.S. forces to be in Syria, nor is there any authorization for military action against Syrian government forces or their allies. If Trump orders another illegal attack, the U.S. will be committing more acts of war against a government that poses no threat to us, that's Syria, has done nothing to us or our treaty allies, and is still fighting inside its own internationally recognized borders. But voices of those supporting the strikes and punishing Russians and Syrians sounded stronger. Quote, White House considers new military action against Syrian regime, wrote the Washington Post on March 5th. The newspaper added details on who pushed for the attack, mainly National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, and who objected. Interestingly, the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. Quote, other officials, particularly at the White House and the State Department, appear more open to renewed action against Assad, close quote. This is the background of Putin's speech on March 1st. The Russian president spoke of the new Russian missiles impervious to Aegis, the anti-ballistic missiles of the U.S., and unstoppable by ground fire that can turn the U.S. aircraft carriers, the most potent symbol of the U.S. power, into sitting ducks. Russia will sink them in case of an attack on Russia or on her allies, said Putin. Allies is the key word in the message. The threatened ally of Russia is Syria. Putin warned the Americans that their airstrike on Syria may be answered with a strike upon their carrier strike group, CSG, in the area, the ships surrounding an aircraft carrier. If you bomb Damascus, we shall send your CSGs in the Mediterranean and in the Gulf down to the sea bottom. We can incinerate your air bases in the area, too. This is what Putin was saying. The sharply raised stakes were a game changer. Who knows what will be the Russian response to this or other action by the Western allies? The warlike neocons in Washington say Russia is all talk, all bluff. Realists say that the U.S. may suffer the humiliating and painful loss of its CSGs with thousands of lives at sea. The U.S. president had enjoyed the previous strike of Syria with dozens of Tomahawk missiles before returning to his beautiful chocolate cake in Mar-a-Lago. If the strike were revisited upon if the strike were revisited upon the carrier groups, this is a totally different matter. Did you say Pearl Harbor? Even if this exchange would not lead to massive nuclear strikes of the mainland U.S. and Russia and total world-destroying war, it would have a very high price tag. The Russians can even strike President Trump's private club in Palm Beach, Florida, as they naughtily presented on the mock video. In the course of Putin's speech on March 1st, they showed videos of the weapons that he was talking about, and in one video it looks like the weapons are headed towards Florida. It's not clear, but the suggestion that this was a nasty joke by the Russians seems to be right, or because they were pointing out the effectiveness of their anti-ballistic missiles and of their own strike force in retaliation. The point was to show that the American sense that they could get away with a first strike on Russia was not true. Apparently, President Trump discussed the matter now with UK Prime Minister Theresa May. The Brits are for some reason more keen to push for war with Russia. Now they try their best to stop the rapprochement between the U.S. and Russia. The peculiar story of poisoning their own ex-spy with a nerve gas adds spice to their effort, and the Russian embassy troll-twitted, quote, in today's papers, pundits call on Theresa May, British Prime Minister, to disrupt possible U.S.-Russia thaw. No trust in Britain's best friend and ally, close quote. That's an important point, and the Brits are pressing for the same thing the American political establishment is doing to make sure that there is not an understanding peace breaking out between the U.S. and Russia. The nuclear poker game just became more exciting. Are the Russians bluffing, or aren't they? Will they play, or will they drop their cards? That's the question. There's no answer yet. Only history can answer it, and the possible answers are terrifying. Meanwhile, judging by the tense calm in the Mideast and elsewhere, Putin's game has been successful. The U.S. missiles rested in their launching sites, and so did the Russian ones. The Russian-Syrian offensive in Izguta proceeds unabated, while the U.S. ground operations in Syria seem to have come to a standstill, as the Kurds are too busy confronting the Turks. Perhaps we will survive this almost confrontation as we survived the 2011 almost confrontation. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We have been talking about the U.S.-Russia provocations, or the U.S. war provocations against Russia, and the tendency that is shown by the American government to risk war with Russia, and over the years establishing a system of ABMs that would give the U.S. a first strike capacity against Russia. The Russians take this seriously, and President Putin on the 1st of March gave an account of the Russian defensive systems, the Russians' nuclear system of nuclear weapons, that would make the possibility of an American first strike, in fact, impossible. We hope that those who are pressing for war against Russia in Washington, and unfortunately in London as well, will take notice and pay attention to the deterrence offered by the President of Russia. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 11th week of 2018. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making and threats. My thanks tonight, as usual, to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. See No's notes on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, along with articles referred to tonight and other things, including Nicholson Baker's Why I Am a Pacifist, the Myth of the Good War, World War II. We'll conclude tonight with a piece from the Real News Network, a debate on Syria Ghouta, this area held by terrorists on the edge of Damascus, and the left. In a complex proxy war that has killed so many, where should leftists and people of conscience stand? Independent journalist Rania Khalek and scholar Yasser Manif debate the ongoing siege of eastern Ghouta and the wider Syrian war. And that will follow on to this broadcast. That is, as I say, from the Real News Network. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. The AWARE group, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana that produces this program, meets every Sunday from 5 to 6 p.m. at the Hammerhead Coffee Shop on University Avenue in Campustown, University and Wright Street in Campustown. That's Sunday at 5 p.m. It's an open meeting in which local anti-war activities are discussed and the general political situation is under consideration. Members and friends of AWARE are invited to join us 5 to 6 p.m. Sunday evenings at the Hammerhead Coffee Shop. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mandel, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
It's the Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. An international aid convoy has reached the besieged Syrian suburb of eastern Ghouta for the first time in days. Aid was suspended earlier this week amid an ongoing bombardment by Syria and Russia, which seeks to reclaim eastern Ghouta from militant groups. Doctors Without Borders says the Syrian-Russian assault has killed more than 1,000 people. At the UN, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein, denounced the Syrian and Russian bombardment.
Attempts to justify indiscriminate, brutal attacks on hundreds of thousands of civilians by the need to combat a few hundred fighters, as in eastern Ghouta, are legally and morally unsustainable. Also, when you are prepared to kill your own people, lying is easy too. Claims by the government of Syria that it is taking every measure to protect its civilian population are frankly ridiculous.
Well, for a discussion on Eastern Ghouta and the wider Syrian war, I'm joined by two guests. Yasser Munif is an assistant professor of sociology at Emerson College and co-founder of the Global Campaign of Solidarity for the Syrian Revolution. And Rania Khalek is an independent journalist and co-host of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure. Welcome to you both. Let me just say by way of introduction that you are both people on the left with very different views of the Syrian conflict. And given that this issue of Syria has really been polarizing on the left, I really appreciate this opportunity for a dialogue. Rania, you just wrote a piece for RT this week called Syria War, What the Mainstream Media Isn't Telling You About Eastern Ghouta. Explain.
Well, the Western press is generally presenting Eastern Ghouta as a place that is being bombarded just by the Syrian government. It's a one-sided war, and you just don't hear the whole story. Yes, the Eastern Ghouta is being bombarded by the Syrian government, but it's not a one-sided war. Eastern Ghouta is under the control of a collection of Salafi jihadist groups, among them Jaish al-Islam, Falak al-Rahman, Ahrar al-Sham, and there's some elements of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the newest name for the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. These groups are based in different neighborhoods in Eastern Ghouta, and they have been firing and shelling civilians in Damascus for years. And civilians in Damascus have been dying as a result of this. You don't hear about these victims ever really in the Western press because it just doesn't go with the Western mainstream narrative about what's taking place in Syria. But the fact of the matter is that what's taking place right now, which is an escalation, a very brutal military escalation is Eastern Ghouta, there's a context behind it. And that context is that the United States and its allies in the region spent billions of dollars arming and funding a collection of jihadist groups inside Syria, a right-wing armed insurgency that collapsed the state in large parts of Syria and led to a very brutal war that we've been watching play out for the past several years, but people never hear about the role that the West has played.
But what about the argument that we just heard there from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that fighting a few hundred fighters in this besieged suburb doesn't justify this intense bombardment that has killed so many people?
Well, there's a couple of things there. First of all, it's not just a few hundred fighters. Second of all, this isn't about trying to justify the military means that are being used to take back these areas. But there does need to be, we need to put some context to this. And that is that, back in August, Falak al-Rahman actually signed in Geneva a ceasefire agreement that went into effect for a few months with the Russians. And then they violated that agreement in December by participating in suicide attacks against Syrian government installations. And that actually broke the agreement with Eastern Ghouta and actually led to the escalation in violence that we see now. On top of that, there's also a lot of pressure on the government from people in Damascus to do something about these groups, because for the past several years, they've been firing at people in Damascus on a daily basis, and the people there have had enough. They're very angry about it. So that's what's led to the escalation of violence here. And frankly, the international community hasn't really done much to try to de-escalate the violence because they haven't been really participating in any sort of attempts to put in place reconciliation agreements. And on top of that, the international community, particularly the West, has played a huge role in creating the conditions that started this in the first place by arming and funding these groups inside Syria to begin with. And let's remember the ideologies of these groups. What are they fighting for? They are fighting to impose an Islamic state. They are Salafi jihadist groups that are no different in their rhetoric and in their intentions than the Islamic State, than ISIS. And they also participate openly with al-Qaeda. And so that needs to be taken into consideration as well. They are also firing on civilians who are trying to leave. This in no way justifies, again, the military assaults of the government, but we do need to put some context into place here because this is not a one-sided fight. And I would also argue that it's not that different than what we saw take place in Iraq to try and rout ISIS from various Iraqi cities. The Iraqi government, a sovereign government, fought with the same military tactics, in fact, to get rid of ISIS in the areas that they took over. And again, I don't agree with all those tactics, but the Syrian government really is doing no different Yet it's placed under this level of scrutiny that you just didn't see happen in the Iraqi case.
I should clarify that according to the Associated Press, the number of fighters in Eastern Ghouta is about 20,000, and the figure of a few hundred refers specifically to the number of Al-Qaeda-linked fighters. So Yasser Manif, if you could respond to what we just heard from Rania Khalek, she says that it was the militants actually in Eastern Ghouta whose rejection of ceasefire efforts have led to this conflict now. And also that what we're seeing is not that much different from then, for example, the US bombarding Mosul to dislodge the Islamic State.
I think this narrative is very disturbing. Rania started by saying, I'm not justifying the Syrian regime or the Russian bombardment of the region of Eastern Ghouta, but then justifies throughout. What's happening in Eastern Ghouta right now is mass bombing and mass killing of a population that is unable to defend itself, that has been besieged since 2012, that is being starved. People have been living on 400 calories a day for several years now. It seems that the blame is put on the people who are inside Al-Ghouta. She adds also context. I think that the context that should be added is that the violence of the Syrian regime didn't really start in 2011. The violence of the Syrian regime started in 1970 with the coup in 1970 of the father and so on. And the installation of a security apparatus and the building of a military institution that harshly, basically crushed any political opposition and closed any political spaces in Syria, tortured any opponents, exiled most of the political parties and people, and tortured thousands of people and killed many as well. So, that's the general context. We shouldn't confuse and put some kind of moral equivalency between the people who are besieged in Eastern Ghouta and the violence of the Syrian regime and the Russian and the Iranian and Hezbollah, whom are also very sectarian. I agree with her that there are sectarian among the opposition, but the Shia sectarianism is as powerful as the Sunni. The militia that are coming from Iraq are very violent and sectarian. The Iranian are very violent and sectarian. They have been funding the Syrian regime since 2011. And the Russians have been also supporting and funding the Syrian regime. So this idea of a foreign intervention that is backing the opposition is very surreal and one-sided, according to Rania.
But Yasser, let me put to you a clip from Joe Biden that I think captures what I find puzzling about the Syrian war, which is what the Syrian government was supposed to do in response to the role that outside players that are trying to overthrow it have played. No one can justify cracking down on peaceful protesters. But what happens when it becomes a proxy war? So on this front, I want to play what Joe Biden said in 2014 about what the U.S. allies in the Gulf did in Syria.
Our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world.
So that's Joe Biden speaking in 2014. So yeah, so what about that? Does the Syrian government have the right to fight those forces, especially the jihadist forces, who are not just a threat to the Syrian government, but also especially to minorities like Christians and Druze and Shiites inside Syria?
The Syrian conflict is very complex, and I think one of the dangers of the narrative described by Rania and others, is this very reductive kind of explanation, kind of binary, where there is only the West and Europe and the intervention on the one hand, and then the Syrian regime. When in fact it's a very complex conflict, and I think the most important element is the Syrian revolution, the grassroots movement, the popular revolt against the Syrian regime that are part of what happened in 2011. That is an aspiration for democracy and freedom and dignity. And there are many dimensions to that conflict. I think the way I view it is there is a popular uprising, a revolution in Syria that started in 2011. And that revolution has been countered by several reactionary forces, including the Syrian regime and its allies, the ISIS and Al Qaeda and its allies, and the West and its allies. And it's very unfortunate to see some of the left, I don't know if it's considered still the left, siding with the Assad regime or trying to be silent or denying the violence of the Syrian regime, when in fact we should do whatever is possible to support the Syrian revolution against this multiple reactionary forces.
Ronnie Khalek, a lot there to respond to, including that if one is criticizing the opposition today, then you're denying the agency of the protesters who rose up in 2011.
Well, Yasser made a lot of claims that I actually want to respond to, and I'll start with this. I think he's presenting a very dishonest narrative about the uprising in 2011. And I think that we should be honest about this. It's now 2018, and presenting this sort of romanticized version of there was this utopian, beautiful, secular leftist uprising that was crushed is just not accurate. Yes, there were people who participated in protests in Syria who had secular ideals and leftist ideals and wanted, more freedoms and more democracy. That's absolutely true. There were also, though, and we should be honest about this, there was also some elements of the uprising that were sectarian and Islamist in nature and had very bad intentions and were calling for very bad things. And there was also some components of the uprising that were armed, and there were clashes from the beginning. So it's not simplistic, perfect leftist uprising versus mean evil government. That's first. Second, Yasser mentioned the intervention of Russia and Iran and Hezbollah. And he's right, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah did intervene in Syria. However, the reason that I emphasize so much more on U.S. intervention is two reasons. First, we're speaking to an American audience, and they haven't been told the honest truth about what the U.S. has done in Syria. That's first and foremost. But secondly, the intention of these interventions matter. The Iranian, Russian, and Hezbollah intervention in Syria was at the behest of the Syrian government. The sovereign government of Syria called on its allies to come help it prevent state collapse, because that is what Syria was facing. It was facing state collapse. And when the state collapsed, armed insurgent groups made up of Salafi jihadi fighters, many of whom were foreign fighters, by the way, took over those areas. So they were there to help restore order and help keep Syria from collapsing and turning into Libya. From the U.S. side, though, U.S. intervention was not there to prevent state collapse. U.S. intervention was armed and funding an insurgency that was actually leading to state collapse. And it was leading to the rise of a failed state across much of Syria, which, by the way, was then filled by thousands of foreign fighters coming into the Turkish border, and which the U.S. practically encouraged because they thought it would force the regime to make concessions, which of course it didn't. And then after that, ISIS came in a lot of those areas and took over some of those areas and started kidnapping Westerners. And the Qataris ended up paying millions of dollars for the release of these Westerners, basically giving ISIS the startup funding it needed to consolidate its fighters in Raqqa and in the east of Syria, and ultimately invading Iraq and taking over a third of Iraq. That is what U.S. intervention led to. And as a result, you had the brutality of ISIS and a massive influx and flow of refugees into Europe, leading to the rise of right-wing politicians across Europe, and ultimately you could even say the election of Donald Trump, because he used the refugee crisis and the brutality of ISIS to fearmonger, and he campaigned on that and won over that. So we have to think about the causes and consequences of this war, and those are the consequences of U.S. intervention that are never discussed and talked about, and that is why it's so important to focus on U.S. intervention. And as for the last point I want to make, just one more point about the issue of Shia sectarianism versus Sunni sectarianism. You're comparing Hezbollah, groups like Hezbollah and Iran, to Salafi jihadist groups. In my opinion, that there's absolutely no comparison whatsoever, because Salafi jihadist groups impose impose Saudi Arabia-style laws on people. They kill minorities. They subject women to second-class gender status. I don't see the same thing happening when Hezbollah comes into an area. I don't see them killing minorities. That's just not happening. Nobody wants to live under Salafi jihadi groups. And in fact, Iran and Hezbollah have played a major role protecting and saving people in the region from ISIS, including Sunnis, by the way, including Sunnis, saving Sunnis from ISIS as well, who are working alongside Hezbollah and Iranian-linked groups. So I think he's presenting a completely false narrative that does not in any way comport with what's happening on the ground here.
Before I get a response from Yasser Manif, Ronnie, let me ask you, because you were talking about causes. Before the U.S. intervention, before the proxy war flares up, is it fair to say that if Assad had just responded in a legitimate way to the protesters' demands, so those protesters who were demanding reforms, not even regime change back then, and not chosen to crush them so brutally, that he could have avoided all this?
I actually don't think he could have. I'm not saying the Syrian government had a good response. They responded very stupidly and very brutally, and I'm not in any way justifying that. And Yasser can say as much as he wants that I'm justifying all these things. I'm not, but I apparently have to continue to add these qualifications to my statement. But no, I don't think they could have prevented this, because from the very outset, you did have certain elements, particularly elements connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, that were demanding that Assad step down from the beginning. And they continue to demand that. I mean, he released prisoners, political prisoners at the behest of protesters. He released many political prisoners. And that, they would continue to say that's not enough. He needs to step down. So there was elements and components. Yes, there were people calling for reform and not calling for regime change, but there were elements calling for regime change. And those are the elements that were being backed and funded by the U.S. and its allies in the region. I mean, you have a government that I don't think there's really anything the Syrian government could have done to avoid this. When you have the most powerful government in the world funding an armed insurgency, a right-wing armed insurgency inside your country, I mean, it's kind of inevitable that it's going to descend into lawless chaos the way that it did. And I actually want to add one more thing about U.S. intervention in Syria. There's actually illegal under international law to fund an insurgency inside another country. That was a ruling that was decided by the International Court of Justice it was in a ruling Nicaragua versus the United States, basically stating it was illegal and violated Nicaraguan sovereignty for the U.S. to fund the Contras in that country. And that's very, very similar what the U.S. did in Syria. So again, it's very important that leftists understand what the U.S. did in Syria. And that is to fund a right-wing, fascistic insurgency that is completely illegal and very, very similar to the sort of death squads the U.S. funded in the Central America in the 1980s.
That's going to wrap part one of this discussion between Rania Khalek and Yasser Manif on Eastern Ghouta and the Syrian war. Join us in part two.